Likutei Sichos, Chelek Chavdaled, Volume 24, the first Sicha for Parshas Devarim. This Sicha will explain the concept of translating the Torah into 70 languages, and if this is a good thing to translate the Torah from Lashon HaKodesh, from Biblical Hebrew, to other languages. Just want to familiarize ourselves with two interesting stories that will be quoted in this Sicha. The first one is brought down in Maseches Sofrim, Tractate Sofrim, literally scribes. It says a story of 5 skadim, 5 elders, that wrote the Torah for Talmai, the Greek king. And the Gemara says that this was a day that was so ominous, so difficult, Yom Kosher Yisrael, like the day in which they made the Egel. Why? The Gemara explains because the Torah could not be accurately explained, thoroughly explained in any other language. And after that, the Gemara gives a story of 72 skanim, 72 elders who were commissioned by this very same king, by Talmai. He gathered them together without telling them what it's about, put them each in a separate booth, like in a separate bungalow, and then only then did he tell each one the very same thing, namely to write down, to transcribe the entire Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. And it says that Hashem miraculously put into their minds the very same thoughts, and they all came out with this same rendition, which included 13 changes to the wording in the Torah, because they understood while they were transcribing it that if they won't make these changes, perhaps they can be misunderstood. One of the classical ones is, in the Torah begins with the words Bereshis bara Elikim. In the beginning, Elikim, God created. So they changed it to read God created in the beginning, because otherwise perhaps the guy's mind may understand that in the beginning, so to speak, God was created, and so on. There are other changes. So that's one story. Another story which is recorded in the Sicha Shabbos, and this is a story about Hillel and Shammai. Let's just familiarize ourselves with Hillel and Shammai, the two famous sages. Hillel was the Nasi, he was the leader, and Shammai was the Av Bezdin. Perhaps you can call it the chief justice of the Bezdin of the court. Now, generally, we find that Hillel is the one who is Mekel. He always tends to be more lenient when it comes to halachic rulings, whereas Shammai always tends to be more strict and is always more machmir in his approach to deciding halacha. Now, what was the story? There was a long discussion that was going on there, and finally, Shammai called out and he said that if you're going to provoke me, then I'm going to decree Tumah on a certain type of situation. In other words, he's going to take it even to a further extent in being strict. And it says that they actually stuck a sword in the Beis Medrash, meaning they said everything stops here. Those who come in shall stay in. Those who want to leave should not be able to leave. And we're going to decide the halacha, and the halacha was decided like Shammai. And the Gemara concludes that that day was a very, very difficult day. Why? Because Hillel was subjected to sit there in the rows of the students, and he was bowed and sitting before Shammai like one of the students. And the Gemara says once again that this was a day that was so difficult, so ominous to the Jewish people, like the day when the Egel, when the golden calf was constructed, was made. Now, in short, we're all familiar with the story of the Egel, but just to better be familiar with it while we're going through the Sicha. So the Egel, they came to Aaron and they wanted to make the Egel, and Aaron insisted that he make it. He tried to stall for time, and after everything just sped up against his wishes, Aaron declared Chag Lashem Mocher, that tomorrow will be a festival for Hashem. And again, his intention was to delay them even more with the hopes, and also he was certain that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to come down the next day, and indeed it won't end up being a day of Avodah Zarah, rather it'll be a day of celebration for Hashem. Let's go into the Sicha. So on the pasuk, the fifth pasuk of this parsha, where it says Be'ever hayarden be'eretz Moav, that in the other side of the Yarden, in the land of Moav, Hoyel Moshe be'er satira zeis lemer. Moshe set out to be'er. Be'er means to expound, to clarify this Torah saying. And then it goes on with the rest of Chumash Devarim. So the Chazal tell us in these words that what does it mean be'er, that he expounded on it, he explained it, that he actually said it to them in 70 languages. And likewise, we find later in Parshas Kisavai, if you look in chapter 27, verses 4 through 8, over there Moshe instructs them that when they cross over the Yarden, this is after his passing, that he tells them that they should write all these words, meaning write the entire Torah on the stones, and he also uses this expression, Bayer Heitev, that it should be well expounded. And again, the Chazal tell us that he instructed them to write it in 70 languages. So the Rebbe brings now the story which we mentioned in the introduction about the 5 elders that wrote the Torah for Talmai, and that the Gemara concludes that this was such a difficult day for the Bnei Yisrael, like the day of when the Egel was constructed. So the Rebbe asks, there seems to be several questions here that pop up right away. Number one, the fact that Moshe already had translated the Torah into 70 languages, and later he told them, he commanded them to also write it down in 70 languages, that seems to imply that there is a good purpose, there's something positive about translating the Torah into 70 languages, and this also includes Greek amongst all the other languages. So why is it a problem? Why was it such a difficult day? Moreover, another question. We say that the Torah could not be properly or thoroughly explained in any other languages. The fact is that they already had said it in 70 languages. Moshe Rabbeinu had said it in 70 languages and instructed them to say it in 70 languages, which also, like I said, includes Greek. And in fact, in the Gemara Yerushalmi, the Gemara says that they checked all the languages and they found that the only language in which the Torah can be properly translated and thoroughly understood is in Greek. So what's going on? But this seems to say over here that the Torah cannot be explained in any whatsoever language. Moreover, we find that Greek is such a unique language and so to speak, compatible with the language of Torah, that according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, you can write the Torah in Greek. Now the main question, of course, is, what is this comparison to, quote, the day in which the Egel was made? That because it wasn't able, they weren't able to thoroughly explain the Torah, it is so bad. It is so to speak, chamur. It's such a serious problem that it's like the day when the Egel was made. And says the Rebbe, this expression we also find in the story in regards to Hillel and Shammai, as we said in introduction. And over there too, we need to understand. What is it? Why was this day so difficult? What was so bad about it? So Shammai won. So the halacha became like Shammai. And Hillel had to sit there and absorb it and take it in. Why is this such a difficult time, such a difficult setting, like the day that when Egel was made? So the Rebbe will understand this by first appreciating the emphasis in the expression of the Chazal, the emphasis in the wording of the choice of wording of our sages. You see, it doesn't say that it was as difficult as when they made the Egel or the making of the Egel. Rather, it says like the day of when they made the Egel. You see, the actual difficulty of the Egel perhaps can be understood to have been the next day. The actual problem really was the next day when they ended up worshiping it as Avodah Zarah. And in fact, that was Aaron's intention, as we said in the introduction. And that's why he tried to delay them, to postpone things, by saying, Chag L'Shem Machar, that tomorrow will be the festivity. But had they not woken up early, because the Yetzer Hara got them up early out of bed in order to cause them to sin, then indeed Moshe would have came, and they would have all together burnt this Egel, destroyed it, and there would be no problem. So what does it mean, like the day that the Egel was made? So the Rebbe explains The day that the egel was made means that it's not so much the problem that they made the egel, because the fact that they made the egel, as we explained, could have ended up to be a very good thing. It could have ended up well. Rather, that the day that they made the egel, that entire day was dedicated to the egel, and that entire day became, so to speak, a hachana, a preparation for what came afterwards. And the fact that afterwards came something bad turns this day, into a whole entity of something terrible. Meaning, in short, this day is the day that made about the potential. It brought about the possibility, the potential of the negativity that came later. Likewise, says the Rebbe, is the issue with translating the Torah into Greek. The fact that you cannot thoroughly translate the Torah into Greek, into any language, but it's even into Greek, meaning all the variations of the Torah and all the various principles in the Torah. There's, like, for example, Ein Mukdam U'Ma'uchar b'Torah, there's no exact chronological order in the Torah, which can confuse things, especially for somebody who's not well versed in Torah, because of the problem that can result out of it. Meaning that a guy, after time, when reading the Torah or reading this translation, can, God forbid, perhaps not properly understand the Torah and understand it wrongly and come out with perhaps an opposite truth or an opposite reality from what the truth is. And as we see, for example, in the story with the 72 Skenim, that miraculously they were able to circumvent that by the fact that they made certain changes. This is what the problem is. This is the issue with the Torah not being able to be translated properly. And this parallels perfectly with, quote, the day that the egel was made. Because the problem is not in the actual translation. The problem is not as much in the actual mistake that they will make later, but rather that this action, this day, is what makes it potentially possible for that to happen. In other words, this is the day that prepares for that problem. And the same is also in the same idea is also plays a role in the story of Hillel and Shammai. The difficulty is not so much in the situation as it was, but rather to what it could have led, what this could have brought about. That all the halachas should end up being like Shammai and not according to Hillel, as it needs to be, because Hillel was the Nasi, Hillel was the actual leader, and Shammai was only the Av Bezdin. Now, since all matters in Torah are exact, they're very precise, it's understood that the fact that we compare these two episodes to the day that the egel was made is to illustrate, is to indicate how not only how difficult it is, but also how it's a preparation for what come afterwards. But not only that, but moreover, that there is actually a comparison. There is inherent connection between what happened in these two stories, or what could have potentially happened in these two stories, to what the egel represents, to what happened by the egel. Now let's examine what really was the idea behind the egel. In other words, why exactly did the Yidden decide that they have to make an egel? Moshe is not showing up, so appoint a new leader. Why are they making an egel? What is this all about? So the Mefarshim explain that it's not that the Yidden were eager to worship Avodah Zarah. That wasn't on their mind. Rather, they were seeking another level of intermediary between them and Hashem. In other words, it seems that Hashem himself set up the game in that manner, that there should be an intermediary. He appointed Moshe to stand between him, so to speak, and the people. And here's what their thinking was. Since the Torah has to come down all the way down to us, to every single person, that every single person should not only believe that there's Hashem, not only have faith in godliness, but also that they should, quote, know godliness, connect to it. So what did Hashem do? What did they experience? What did they see? That Hashem made that since every person has to know godliness and has to connect to Hashem, so he gave them an ish elikim, he gave them a godly man to connect them to Hashem. So they thought that it would be best, it would be appropriate to make another level of intermediary, make something else that can bring it down even further and bring it down to them. Now, why an egel? Why a calf? So we know the Medrash tells us that by Matan Torah, when Hashem revealed himself in Har Sinai, they saw what's going on in the heavens. And they saw the Merkava, they saw the holy chariot. And there, one of the things they saw is the Pnei Shor. It says there's a face of an ox there, whatever that means spiritually. But the Medrash tells us that they saw the Pnei Shor, and they quote, Shamtu has said, they slipped it out, they kind of like snatched it, and they used it, but unfortunately they misused it, and what came out of it afterwards, a matter of Avodah Zarah. And this explains what it means when we say the day that the Egel was made. Not as much the fact that they later worshiped the Egel, but the day that the Egel is made. There's something inherently problematic with the day that the Egel was made. You see, the mere fact that they were looking for another level of separation between them and Hashem, another level of intermediary between them and Hashem, because this is not something that Hashem told them to do, because it didn't come from a direct command from Hashem, therefore later from it could evolve the whole idea of Avodah Zarah. In other words, even though their intentions were perhaps good, at least in the initial stages, their intention was a good one. They wanted to use this as a tool, as a means to bring down godliness even more. They wanted to connect Hashem even better. But the fact that it didn't come from a directive of Hashem led to the fact that later it turned into Avodah Zarah. And that's what's inherently wrong with the day. This is what the Medrash means when it says they slipped away this shor, this face of the ox of the Merkava. You see, because in the Merkava, what does the face of the ox represent? What does it do? It reveals godliness. But because they took their own initiative, and it was a wrong one because it wasn't commanded by Hashem, this later led to the exact opposite, that this concealed, this went against godliness, not revealed godliness. And now we can appreciate better the likeness to the story with Talmai, the story with the Greek king and the Skenim who translated the Torah. You see, when Hashem, in our parsha, when Moshe does it, obviously Hashem told him to do it. When Hashem commands to translate the Torah, then there's no possibility for anything bad to come out of it. It can never evolve into something negative. However, when the commandment, when the directive comes from Talmai, from the Greek king, meaning it's not coming from Hashem, and here it's coming from a guy who's commissioning it, then it can unfortunately lead to very negative results, and that's why it was a very, very difficult situation. And the example for it is, like I said in the introduction, where they understood, the 72 elders understood that if they would translate verbatim, Bereshis bara Elokim, who knows what the Goyim might conclude from it, as if something else created God, and therefore they had to turn it around, they had to change it. So you see that when it comes from Hashem, there's no worry, there's no problem that can perhaps come out of it. But when it comes from a Goyish king, already it can lead to something bad. And this explains why it's similar to what happened on the day that the Egel happened, because it didn't come from Hashem. It came on their own initiative, and it already immediately, from the onset, had the potential of distorting things, of becoming having the exact opposite results of what was intended. And now we'll look at the story of Hillel and Shammai. In general, we find that Hillel is Mekel. Hillel typically, they are the more lenient when it comes to halacha, when it comes to psak din. And the reason for it is because it says the shoresh of their neshama, the source of their neshama, is more from chesed. Whereas Shammai, typically they are machmir, they're more strict because they come from gvura. What's the difference between chesed and gvura? What's the difference between kindness and severity, or din or judgment? So the Medrash tells us that when it came to the creation of the world, chesed amar yivra. Chesed said, yes, Hashem should create the world. Whereas din, or emes, judgment, or truth, or in this case, this aligns with gevura, with severity, said, no, you shouldn't create the world. Once the world is created, how does this express itself? So it expresses itself as that if you follow midas chesed, that is a constant mode of seeking ways of drawing down godliness into the world, because the world defines the world as a positive thing. And therefore it seeks constantly for more and more ways to bring more and more godliness into the world. Whereas din is always seeking the world, being that it sees it as a negative thing, right? It didn't really want it to be for it to be created. It felt that it is something separate from godliness. Therefore, it's always seeking to be mevatel the world, so to speak, to break the world, to crush it. In other words, from a standpoint of din, you kind of see the world as if it's something separate from Hashem. And therefore one has to continuously and consistently distance himself from the world. Whereas from chesed, you always see that potentially the world is godliness. And therefore you have to find which way in order to bring out the godliness more in the world. In a very refined manner, you could look at it this way. From a standpoint of Midas Hadin, it's as if there are two entities here. There's Hashem and there's the world. And this is the comparison. This parallels to what happened with the Egel. Again, they saw themselves as two separate things, them and Hashem, and they need to find some mode, some intermediary, some means of, so to speak, connecting these two separate things. So that's why it's connected, it's compared to the quote, the day that the Egel was made. Now, in actuality, from these two stories, nothing negative came out. Moreover, if you look at it, there's some positive that actually resulted. From the story of the Greek translation, it came out that also to the nations, there's also now an emphasis of Achdus Hashem, of the unity of Hashem, because of all the changes they made and the clarifications. Moreover, the language itself, the Greek language itself, was also elevated in the sense, to the extent that according to halacha, the only language in which you can write svarim, you can write the Torah, is in Greek, and it even has a certain sense of holiness. Now the story with Shammai and Hillel, what came out of it is also a positive that came out of it. Because of this story, Shammai became somewhat connected to Hillel, to the extent that we do find throughout Shas that even Shammai, who, like we said, ordinarily his Piskei Dinim are always on the side of Gvura, on the side of Chumrah, on the side of stringency, but we find throughout the Shas that there are many places where he is mekel, he is lenient, just like Hillel. Says the Rebbe, because the words of tzaddikim are kayomim la'ad, they exist and they last forever. In other words, they have an everlasting effect. Therefore, and especially if it's written in the Torah, so it must be that these words of Aaron, which he declared, Chag L'Hashem Mocher, that tomorrow will be a Chag to Hashem. When was that tomorrow, by the way? That's the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down and witnessed the Egel, and he broke the Luchos. We all know that Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. And like the Arizal writes, that there is a hint over here. When he said in the words Chag L'Hashem Mocher, he was hinting to the end of time when Shiva Asar B'Tammuz will be converted into a day of joy and celebration. It says the Rebbe that likewise we can say the same for the translation of the 70 languages, especially in our times, in the later generations, in the latter generations, that is. And we see especially how the well springs of Pnimius HaTorah, of the deepest secrets of the Torah, were translated into many, many languages, which are the prominent languages of the 70 languages of Ummah Sa'olam, of the nations of the world, through the Frierdiker Rebbe, that put in a great effort and emphasis in spreading the deepest secrets of Chassidus through all the 70 languages. What this does is not only it brings the secrets of the Torah to them and the oneness of Hashem to them, but also it elevates the 70 languages of all the nations. Not only does it bring the Torah down to them, but it also elevates their languages. The fact that their languages were now used as a conduit of spreading Torah, true Torah, and the secrets of Torah. Because through them came now a better appreciation, understanding of Achdus Hashem, of the unity of Hashem. And the Rebbe says that this, of course, hastens the Geula when it says, that Hashem says, then I will give all the nations that they'll speak all a common language, which is what? To call out in the name of Hashem, to all together serve Hashem as one entity together.